Hi, welcome to the Libertarian Alternative. My name is Mark Selzer, and today's guest is Nathaniel Branden. Thank you for coming out. You are a author of many books, one about Ayn Rand and many other books about psychotherapy or dealing with psychotherapy,
self-esteem, autonomy, self-responsibility, man-woman relationships.
And the subject for today is a book of yours called Taking Responsibility.
Yes.
This seems to be a subject, an idea, taking responsibility for anything that is almost void from human relationships at this time. I think it's a cynical view, but I think taking actual responsibility for something is very rare nowadays.
My interest in the subject grew out of the work I've been doing for the last 30, 40 years in self-esteem, which is, I suppose, the area of my greatest specialization. I was always interested in what are the various factors which influence, for good or for ill, our self-esteem. And very early on, it was obvious to me that taking responsibility, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, is of paramount importance. You cannot have a good level of self-esteem if you don't lead a basically self-responsible life. To give a little bit of backstory, I wrote a number of books dealing with self-esteem from different aspects, but the climax of them was a book called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, which has become, I guess, my most famous book. And in it I had a chapter on self-responsibility, and I actually had another on living consciously. But when I wrote those chapters, I realized that I said enough for a book on self-esteem, but there was so much more I wanted to say about taking responsibility in one case and living consciously in another, that I proceeded to write in the late 1990s 2 subsequent books, one called Taking Responsibility, the other called The Art of Living Consciously. Now, what do I mean by living self-responsibly? It means, number one, I am responsible for my life and well-being. I am the author of my choices and actions. I am responsible for the level of consciousness I bring to my work. I am responsible for the level of consciousness I bring to my relationships. I am responsible for the words coming out of my mouth. I am responsible ultimately for my personal happiness. I am responsible for my self-esteem. Now, one of the most tragic errors that people make when they're in trouble is to get lost in the fantasy that somewhere there's a phantom rescuer who is going to spare them the necessity of thought and effort or struggle and somehow heal all the pain of their life and make everything wonderful for them without any great effort on their part required. And I'm a practicing psychotherapist, among other things, and I'm always telling my clients, no one is coming. No one is coming. And I used to do nothing but groups, and I had a number of sayings that I used a lot. So there was a woman in one of my groups who loved to do needlepoint. So she'd do my sayings into needlepoint, and we'd hang them on the wall of my office. One was, no one is coming. Another one was quoting a famous Spanish proverb, which I love. Take what you want, said God, and pay for it. Or a third one I love, living well is the best revenge. Mm-hmm. Or another one on our wall was, it isn't what they think, it's what you know. Well, anyway, one day in group, a client with a sense of humor challenged me and said, Nathaniel, you're always talking about no one is coming, but you came. Mm-hmm. I said, correct, but I came to say that no one is coming.
And you came with a bill. You had to pay for it.
Now, you see, we are living in a moment in history, as you correctly pointed out, unfortunately, when the idea of self-responsibility, which was once part of the common sense of American culture, has largely disappeared. Mm-hmm. It's largely vanished. There has never been a time in history when more people felt entitled without any effort or work on their part, but simply because they were in need. And there are so many stories that you can read in the press. I don't know. This is only one story, but it's emblematic of the madness of where we are culturally. Some years ago, an FBI agent was caught embezzling money from the FBI for he had a gambling habit. And eventually, the FBI found them out, and they fired him. And that, you would think in reason, would be the end of the story, except he went to a lawyer and sued the FBI under the Civil Disability Act, arguing that he was suffering job discrimination because of a disease, and the disease was his gambling. And the judge ordered him reinstated on the job.
Unbelievable.
Now, you got to ask yourself, what kind of a world is that? What kind of a lunatic asylum, pardon me, is that? And one could give many more examples. Our whole tort system is rife with every kind of outrageous lawsuit that is creating catastrophes for the legal profession, for the medical profession. These driving doctors out of communities because they simply cannot afford the amount of insurance they have to carry against lawsuits. So people dream, oh, I want some catastrophe, I want somebody to sue. A few years ago, I was with someone. We were catching a movie, and riding up in the escalator, rushing to catch the movie, she rather badly cut her foot. But she was dying to see the movie, so insisted I just get some ice from the candy confectionery stand. And she iced it until the movie was over. And then I ran her over to the emergency room of the hospital, and she got stitches. But that's not the point of the story, is that we were then driving to a dinner, a Christmas dinner or a Christmas Eve dinner in Montecito. So over dinner, we are telling this story. And a woman lawyer sitting at the table says, well, you should sue AMC 14. That's it, you know. And my partner said, what are you talking about? We sued them. They didn't do anything wrong. I cut myself. They had a real serious conversation, and the woman lawyer was saying, you could get a lot of money. Of course, we laughed and did nothing about it. But one hears so much of this kind of thing nowadays, or reads about it. It's sickening.
So let me play the devil's advocate with you and say,
I like that.
Isn't it give you unlibertarian questions, and that would be, isn't society partially responsible for what happens to us? Doesn't society as a whole bear some of the burden for some of our situations?
Yes. For example, when society passes laws that creates dependency, as with many of our welfare programs, when society, via the instrument of government, decides that it will solve a social problem with laws and agencies and rules, and instead the problem worsens, will there be victims? Yes. Are there victims every day of government interference in our lives? Of course. So if by society you mean government, then of course government victimizes most of us one way or the other. However, I'm a working psychotherapist, and what I know is there's no mileage out of seeing yourself as a victim. When people come to see me, let's say, they may have had parents who really were awful. And it isn't that it isn't that the parents never did anything blameworthy, because often they did. But where I'm coming from is I have complete respect for the client's suffering. I have complete respect for whatever they had to go through, and I help them to deal with it and process it. But it doesn't change the fact that after all the self-examining has been done and all the working through of the trauma has been done, the question remains, what can I do to improve the quality of my life? And that's not a question that anybody but me can answer for me. So that no matter how tough your backstory might have been, and it might really have been tough, and it might really be deserving of sympathy or empathy, that's not the point. The point is it good for you to be stuck in the vision of yourself as a victim? Emphatically not, because all it does is it breeds paralysis, passivity, self-pity, and resentment. So anybody who encourages you to see yourself as a victim of men, of women, of the universe, of society, of the cosmos, is not your friend. Is not really thinking carefully about what would serve your well-being.
It seems that the Democratic and Republican parties have the opposite view in a lot of respects. It seems that the Republican Party wants to kind of be the daddy state, and the Democratic Party wants to be the mommy state and kind of encircle us in a cocoon and tell us it's going to protect us from all these things.
The grandfather of all this terrible trends was, of course, Bismarck. He was credited with being the founder of the welfare state. And he was very articulate about what was involved. He said the way to stay in power and to expand power is to create greater and greater dependency. The more people are dependent on government, the less they protest, the less they object, the more pliable they are, the more obedient they are, the less trouble they give us. And the way to do that is to create a nation of dependence. Now, whatever the underlying motives of any politician may be, whether it's conscious, unconscious, or just ignorant, the policies that are in place today tend to create dependency, tend to create non-self-responsibility. Example, a 15-year-old girl gets pregnant, and if she can prove that she has no means of support, and she's not even sure who the father is, the government will give her a little place to live and secure her a minimum standard of living. Gee, I wonder why young kids more and more are getting pregnant. What's wrong with the younger generation today? Moral of the story is this: if you want to discourage a particular piece of behavior, you don't reward it.
But what do we do with the 15-year-old girls that do get pregnant? What do we do with them? How do we, if they cannot support themselves, if they cannot support the child, what happens then?
Well, what happened before we had all this legislation? You tell me what happened.
Well, what happened is the family would have to take responsibility. Perhaps the child would take the responsibility and be aware more that this was going to be a problem.
I don't say that there wouldn't be needing probably some transitional period where you wake up tomorrow morning and all this legislation is eradicated. That would not be realistic. One needs to have a plan for the phasing out of these programs so that it's not a total trauma that makes everything worse. But in the end, it will come down to, look, for example, remember the predictions when some years back, when we first decided we're going to start reforming our welfare legislation during Clinton's tenure. Well, do you remember how many people were predicted all the catastrophes that would happen if we went ahead with that legislation? And of course, just the opposite happened. It didn't have the terrible consequences. It reduced radically the number of people on welfare and gave a great many people much better lives than they had when they were living off of welfare. So, will there need to be a period, of adjustment? Yes. You know, compassion is a wonderful thing, but one should never forget that compassion is passion. And passion without the guidance of intelligence is dangerous. So we need to have passions, to be sure, and we need intelligence to guide us. And if we don't have intelligence to guide us, then we have to make others will become suspicious of how authentic is our compassion.
That's very true. So do you ever see us getting out of this cocoon, this idea that, I mean, it's as if, people are really longing to be free of responsibility. You know, it's like being on a permanent vacation. It seems that people are longing for this.
Well, yes and no. It's true that many people by today are just as you described them. I nonetheless believe that if we began to stop many of our welfare activities, those that could be stopped very fast, I think the majority of people, they might go through a few convulsions in the beginning. They would make an adjustment, and tune in on them a year later. I promise you, the majority of their lives are working better than the year earlier, and they are liking themselves more than the year earlier. But might they go through a few convulsions on the way there? Sure, without doubt. Why am I so sure of that? Because I see the same thing in psychotherapy all the time, where people finally decide to make a change, which is really a change, and which is very frightening. It means living the comfort zone. And they may do a lot of table pounding and crying, etc. And yet, a few weeks later, the world looks very different. A psychotherapist is supposed to know something about how change happens. And I believe that what is most important is that people from an early age be educated in the virtue of self-responsibility. You see, our founding fathers took it so much for granted. They took a level of public decency and maturity for granted, which we cannot take for granted. For people in the 18th century understood much more about accountability than the average person in America knows today. And you can't have a libertarian society successful without people who understand self-responsibility as a way of life. It has to be a spiritual shift, not just an economic or a political shift. It has to be a deep, soulful shift in the way we conceive our own lives and what we think we're entitled to and what we realize we must earn if we want to have it.
And we also need to restore people's right to make a buck no matter what. It seems there's so many regulations and so much licensing on everything that it gets more and more difficult to start a business and more difficult to keep what you earn.
Well, that's why probably of any one group, the biggest people who will be sympathetic to libertarianism are small business, because they are the worst victims of government regulation. The big companies like GE are making so much money, they can bite the bullet and pay the tax, and they're too big. But to an up-and-coming small company, that kind of regulation is much more of a burden that can drive them back into bankruptcy. And that is why they more understand the free market. And the big business has never been really enthusiastic about laissez-faire, because as you know, in the history of this country, big business had a great deal to do with getting the government involved. You know, the conventional BS history says, well, government got more and more involved because capitalism wasn't filling people's needs properly and needed help from the government. The worst offenders were businessmen who went to government to get legislation passed that would give them a competitive advantage against their competitors. Today, what is our biggest welfare program? Talk about welfare? Farm subsidies.
Oh, huge.
All right. Now we have the average person think, well, farm, they still think like those movies, you know, the struggling couple on the farm, you know. That's not what the farm business is. They're large agricultural monsters. They're large industrial giants getting paid money not to produce, not to grow.
And they're millionaires and billionaires in some instances getting government money.
You see, this is why I got so annoyed with the Republicans when for 10 minutes it looked like the time of Newt Gingrich in contract with America. For 10 minutes it looked like we might be moving in a better direction. If you want to go after welfare, you don't begin with going after food stamps. You begin with going after the welfare of the big business. You pick your target. If you want people to believe that you really are sincere and this is not just another gimmick to give the rich an advantage at the expense of the poor, you don't begin with curtailing students' school lunches while leaving untouched this immense welfare to big corporations.
It's harder to get to them because those big corporations are the people that are funding Newt Gingrich and his contract.
See, the point is this. I don't know of any political system with quite so predictable a capacity to shoot itself in the foot as the Republicans. Every time it looks like something better might be about to happen, colossal new stupidity sets in, and the rest is history.
Yeah, that's why I was never a Republican. I looked at the numbers, and so wait a minute, the Republicans seem to be growing government worse than the Democrats.
Well, Bush certainly is.
Bush certainly is. And when you look, there are other people that have done analysis that I've always looked at, and I voted Democrat, and then eventually when they passed the mandatory drug sentencing minimums, I decided that the Democrats were too right-wing for me, and I joined the Libertarian Party.
I'm not a member of the, well, let's put it this way. I'm a libertarian with a small L.
Yeah.
With regard to self-responsibility, one of the great challenges as a fellow libertarian, as someone who wants to support and advocate a free society, a free market society, one has to realize that one of the great challenges of free market capitalism, one of the great advantages, blessings, is the first time in history it created a market for the independent mind.
Mm-hmm.
The bad news is it demands of people a much higher level of self-esteem and self-responsibility than socialism does or the welfare state does. If you have a decent level of self-esteem and you are basically a self-responsible human being, you are therefore more confident in your ability to cope with the challenges of life, and you have much stronger sense of what your own potential resources are. If in contrast you are low in self-esteem and inexperienced in living self-responsibly, freedom is a little bit frightening.
Mm-hmm.
I remember 3 or 4 years ago I was invited to a conference in Kuala Lumpur. I'd never been to Malaysia, and I was very curious, and they were having their international conference on self-esteem. And I went and spent some time there and exploring the place. And one of the things I learned there was, of course, that the government is everywhere. I mean, they're trying to come into the modern world, they're building modern buildings and all that, but it's still in many respects a tribal society. And even in putting together this conference, they have to get many government ministers involved to help them raise the money and to make it all happen. Anyway, I'm curious to know how these people, yet I know they're dying to get into the 21st century, become a player on the world stage in the global economy, how they're handling it all. Anyway, one night, Luck leaves me at a table with a minister after dinner. Everybody else is gone. He and I are chatting. And I have a feeling maybe I can get something here. So I kind of pretend like I'm just thinking aloud. Don't you think globalization is an interesting phenomenon? It seems to me that new economic realities, I'm saying to him, you know, are forcing the world more in a free market direction, whether they're eager to go there or not. I said even countries like France, which is statist to its core, is kicking and screaming, being pulled into a more free market orientation. I was deliberately doing this like a monologue, you know. And I could see his face becoming more and more disturbed as I'm talking. So what happened was I paused and I said to him in a very warm, friendly way, "You're having thoughts about what I'm saying. Do you care to share them with me?" I'll never forget his answer. This is it. Freedom. Long pause. Freedom. A very difficult concept. In what way, says I innocently? He says, it demands so much responsibility of us. Well, welcome to the collision of two cultures. There it is. You can't get it any simpler or any clearer. It demands so much responsibility of us. And it's true. And it's true.
How can we get people to embrace that responsibility?
You have to help them to see more what the opportunities are. And after all, that does happen. Places like Poland and other countries are waking up. You know, it takes time because they had a long occupation between the Nazis and the Russians. The Poles had a long, but it's changing.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's always some people in the country who are into the 21st century, psychologically speaking, already, and they're the leaders. It's an issue of talking to the fears, but to keep people aware of what the advantages are.
So you have to point out, of course, that you can achieve more, and your individuality in that kind of society is important. You know, When I look at, pop music, for instance, I think of it as a very trivial thing. But when I look at the idea that in that, the individual and their unique personality is important, there seems to be a very astute subtext to that, telling us that even something as silly as Elvis or something like this, that his personality, him as an individual, his unique style, is important. Do you think that there's something to be learned from looking at something like that? And do you think that occurred in Russia, that people were looking at that and thought?
Probably. Yeah. I'll tell you why I think so. What's very interesting, I see some of these Russian kids, the rock groups coming over now and being interviewed, talking about, they're smuggled, I don't know if it's Elvis, might be a little later than Elvis. Elvis might go back too far if they're just 20, I don't know what they know about Elvis, but they're talking about people who were hot when they were growing up in their teens, and that American music development, inflamed a lot of imaginations, and some of their biggest dreams were to get to America and to have their own rock group, and of course they succeeded in some cases, which is how I was able to hear them being interviewed on television.
And now they can have their own rock groups there. There is an important, that always gives me hope, that there's an important subtext in American pop culture, that the individual, the personality of the individual is important. Matters. Where in other cultures, you have a more collectivist, the personality of the society matters. But here, I think that's our most important propaganda tool. I'd like to thank you for coming out. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you for coming out.
It was fun.
And for anyone else out there that would like any more information about the Libertarian Party, you can join us online at www.lp.org. And please, next time you're at the post office, waiting in line for a half hour to buy one stamp, register to vote as a Libertarian. We'll see you next time.
Give up, learn to live, show the world you're painted in. The colors there are so deep and rich. Who could resist this magical chill? Hold the freedom in your hands, feel so smooth it never ends. Watch your fear